Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the College of Continuing and Professional Studies webinar, Improving Processes with Process Management Maturity. Thank you so much for joining us today. Next slide, please. It's a pleasure to have you all here this afternoon. My name is Shanta Bulai, and I'll be your moderator for today's webinar. If you have future questions about this webinar or other programs we offer, the college's contact information will be on the last slide of this presentation. So I am delighted to introduce the topic for today's webinar, Improving Processes with Process Management Maturity. Most organizations have processes that are in a developed level of maturity and are challenged with getting to the next level. Understanding process management maturity levels can support sustainable improvement through next levels of process maturity. Without consideration to process management maturity, processes can stall and vary between temporary improvements and process decline. This session will create awareness to the process maturity and process management maturity levels that support accelerated improvement. We will cover the levels of both process maturity and process management maturity that are necessary to align for sustained levels of improvement and reaching performance excellence. Key takeaways will include understanding the levels of alignment of process maturity and process management maturity, gaining some management techniques for integrating process management maturity into strategic process improvement. And lastly, engaging stakeholders in process improvement for process management maturity. It's a pleasure to introduce the presenter for today's webinar, Jim Nelson. Jim is an electrical engineer by degree, and his early career was focused on manufacturing. He progressed to Lean Six Sigma Master Black Belt and transitioned to a continuous improvement and quality focus in his mid-career stage. Jim continued his learning and education by volunteering with organizations including ASQ, Baldrige, ASCM, Penn, and local best practice organizations to expand knowledge on process improvement and excellence. Jim is currently a management consultant, third-party auditor for ISO management systems, and also teaches courses within our business process improvement certificate. Jim, thank you again for joining us and sharing your wisdom with us today. I will pass it over to you.
Thank you very much, Shanta. Good afternoon. Thanks for joining our webinar here again. And to start off with, we're going to go into a couple of polls just to get a little flavor from your perspective to help influence the presentation a little bit. So we're going to start off and we're going to kick off that poll here quick. So if you could just take a couple minutes, there's two questions there. And the first question, what is the top process management challenge in your organization? So there's 6 different options there. There's an other. If you select other, please describe in the chat what that top process management challenges is. And then the second question there in the same poll, what is the difference between processes and process management? So just want to get your quick feedback and understand how this aligns with some of the research that I've been reviewing and understanding to understand where you're at in your process journey and your understanding. So go ahead and take those polls. Okay, so I know we have 300 and some people here, so it's going to be hard to go through all of these, but process, the way things done, management, oversight. Standardization, maturity is long. Okay, so short term, long term. Okay, keep going. Process. So the steps versus the governance, how it gets done versus the way it gets done. Outcome of the process management, yes, okay, and defines the processes to be followed by process management. Good. Actions taken, execution, and management is overseeing in the process. And so it looks like we do have a pretty good blend. People understand that the process that's what gets done. That's how it gets done. The process management is ensuring we have the accountability and the performance of the process understood overall. So I'm seeing a flavor of that, and without belaboring the presentation too much. So it looks like we have a pretty decent understanding of the difference between process and process management. And I'll go into that a little bit as we dive into the presentation here a little further. So appreciate everybody responding to that and helping understand a little further. And back to the presentation here. I'm assuming everybody can see the presentation. All right. So from your poll and from a poll now that also I'm involved with APQC along with ABPMP. So APQC is the American Productivity and Quality Center. They do annual surveys trying to understand what's going on with processes and productivity across organizations. And from this year, they actually performed this. And you can see there is still a pretty good dispersion of the importance, but defining and mapping end-to-end processes is the one that pretty much came out on top. And that somewhat aligns with some of the experiences and expectations I have been involved with. So as I have a career 25 years in manufacturing and some service organizations to help understand processes very, very well. Quality, continuous improvement, and things like that. So I've implemented process, designed processes, and then helped to improve those processes. And now I'm on the other end of the spectrum here where I'm out auditing organizations. I'm not a financial auditor. I audit their management systems. ISO 9001, AS 9100. These are standards that organizations have to adopt and then comply or conform to with processes. So they have to bring a process approach, understand risk, and then improve their processes over time. I see hundreds of organizations, probably 50 to 70 different organizations a year. Every week I'm out visiting a different organization, learning about their processes and how they conform to requirements. The ISO standard, AS 9100, these two many standards that I audit to, they all require processes in the organization to manage those processes, have strategic objectives associated with the processes, and understand their performance level and then improve them over time. And that's one of the things from a certification perspective, these people have to work on their processes, have to understand their processes. And so they have a level of maturity in their processes that, you know, is up there in a little bit of a higher range of maturity versus organizations that may not be subscribing to these standards and or small organizations that don't need or don't want these types of certifications. Yes, there are organizations out there that have high maturity processes. However, as we go through and learn a little bit more about these organizations, the complexity, the impact and alignment to goals and prioritizing their efforts can be various. So that's one of the things in the past from APQC and from my own experience is that moving more towards this definition of your processes, mapping your processes so that there is some understanding and awareness to the processes. That's becoming a priority in many organizations because we have less and less people to perform these processes. Resources are tight and we don't have the same amount of people to help in those efforts to get the processes completed as we did in the past. And so this does tend to be a focus for organizations. Sometimes it is implied and sometimes it is explicit. I see that in the strategic objectives of organizations overall, and especially when they're going through these certification audits and things like that, you can see that there are process improvements that are up in the top of those organizations' strategic initiatives. Best practice organizations, they know that choosing measures and metrics are a critical step for them to help understanding their process and generating that insight and the reporting associated with processes to help them understand those processes better and continue the definition and the improvement to those processes. So supplementary, well-balanced measurement provides some of that actionable insights into the organization's performance, and then also can help in identifying those challenges and opportunities that align with the organization's culture and their strategic goals. So also from APQC, what's some of the changes that are needed in process management discipline? So again, going back to some of their survey results here, and here we see that integration with IT and creating collaborative culture jump up to the top of the list because we're recognizing that with less people, we need to have some automation within our processes and use systems and databases for some of that information to be collected, stored, organized, and then reported on for that relevant performance of the process. Also, having collaboration among the processes within it and among it helps us to understand what needs to happen within the process. So it gives us a way to prioritize some of the different initiatives and improvements necessary to keep the process in a maturing type of level. So as those metrics and measures continue to be a priority and understand the process performance, these organizations are looking to applications. And we see that where there's more and more of these software applications that are being brought up for you to understand and manage processes, manage your data and information within the process and within the organization. These can bring a challenge with monitoring, capturing, and reporting the process data because sometimes IT can be the focus, and that becomes a challenge for working within the process and helping the people that are working the process to understand those applications, become competent, and develop the necessary skills and abilities for them to work within those systems and processes. That barrier can also hinder us from improving the process and become a hindrance to change management. And so collaboration also here then is paired with that because we need people that are engaged in the process. We need people that understand what the needs and expectations of the process are, and then can also help us to improve the process because they're in it. They're in the environment. The Japanese use a term called gemba, being in the environment and understanding what's going on within that. So enabling that collaboration within and around processes, that priority helps us to understand those process performance and then support the process improvement efforts. So how is this integration and collaboration supposed to happen? Well, good question. Some organizations use project management to execute some of the change and some of the improvements within their processes. Some directly use the IT resources, and those are the responsible for that integration into the process and collaborating with the cultures. In my experience, there's a lot of variation across how these changes happen, how processes are improved, and the formality and the success of those initiatives, especially without mature processes or without mature process management. And I think that's part of the key here that I want to talk about is getting into what is that difference between process maturity and process management maturity to help you understand now how to take and gather both those together. So in process, what is process maturity? So process maturity is considered through the definition, the control, and the performance of a process. It's a measure of how well defined, controlled a company's processes are. High level of process maturity shows that there's definition, there's documentation, as well as understanding and following procedures and continuous improvement within processes. So we can take those inputs, the process steps, the decision, and the outputs and understand the flow of value from the supplier out to the customer. Process maturity can refer either to the maturity of a single process or of all processes in a department or a company. And we'll talk about value streams here in a little bit. So either way, process maturity is a good gauge of process health in an organization and within the process itself. Low maturity of processes, that's indicated by ad hoc process. Ad hoc steps, activities, little or no formal definition of the process, performance levels typically unknown, and high variation within the process, and then processes that are very rigid, unchanging, and unable to move into a next level of improvement or performance because of some of those barriers to improvement. The high maturity processes, those are defined. Sometimes they are also automated as much as possible with some different types of software and applications to help in data and systems. There's flexibility in the processes, pre and post-process connections. So those interrelations between the processes are known, and there's streamlined handoffs between the process. And then they're continuously improved to innovate and adapt to those new learnings within the process. Process management maturity now. Now we're getting into a little bit more about the level of leadership engagement with the process. Ownership of the process, direction of the process, collaboration within and across processes. And so in over half the organizations that I'm going audit and I've been involved with in the past, process improvements are typically inconsistent and ad hoc at best. So low process management maturity is indicated by that lack of ownership and engagement by leadership. Unknown process performance, meaning we're not sure on how well the process is, how good is a process. And also, you also have unclear direction on process improvement and unclear direction on where the process is going in the future. High maturity, process management maturity, includes ownership. A process has an owner. It includes stewardship, where the process is heading, where the accountability lies, and how the leadership and the governance across that process is working with the other process. It includes understanding the process performance, the status of it now, the trends, and the variation within the process, and then the strategic direction on process improvement. So taking those and utilizing that process management maturity to go back and increase your process maturity overall. So in my experience as an ISO and aerospace auditor with these organizations that I've audited across hundreds of them in learning their process, there's a focus on process and improving processes. So that typically gets a check mark. Process maturity is, up to a certain level. However, typically there's a lack of process management maturity. And that, therefore, creates a barrier, a ceiling for organizations, and it stagnates their improvement efforts. Or if they are improving, they don't have the ability to sustain those improvements. And over time, it fades, it degrades because there isn't that ownership and that stewardship to continue helping it. So I've seen this in many organizations, and it's a good awareness to understand that there is a difference between process maturity and process management maturity. So now we'll jump a little bit into some of the directions and some of the details on what happens within processes and process management. I'm just going to check the chat here quick and see if there's any quick questions for the fact that leaders are quick to the solutions and oftentimes look into IT tools as a solution and not empowering those closest to the process often leads to resistance. So Abdul, correct. Yes, and that's where we'll talk a little bit about process management maturity to help in that effort, because going to a technical solution like an application sometimes can thwart the process of the maturity of the process, and therefore maybe not getting the people involved to help move that forward appropriately. So good point there. So where do we start out with? Typically, there's an ad hoc process. Somebody's doing something. There are steps being taken. And depending upon the individual, they may get done very differently. And at some point, leadership needs to recognize that, hey, this is a process. We need to control this process to some degree and manage it. And therefore, then we recognize that we need to take this process and organize it. So through that effort, then we're going to understand some of the process. Excuse me a second while I hide this. There we go. Develop a consistent process. So from leadership here, we recognize this and need to get that organization in place. So start to understand strategically, how do we develop consistency within the process? So as that consistency comes into play, we probably might start understanding that there's issues and problems within the ad hoc processes going on, and we may have complaints from the suppliers or the customers of a process because of that inconsistency that's going on. Therefore, now we start to recognize and put into play something where we can have some consistency in that process and creating a repeatable process. So once we have a repeatable process, now we can, have some consistency to it and start to understand that process a little bit more. However, here's a great opportunity for us from a leadership perspective to understand now, what do we need to help this process move forward and mature further, get some ownership in place. And typically there's some functionality at play there. Matrix organizations, this can be a little more challenging, and depending upon the scope and the boundaries of the process. Sometimes processes have multiple functions involved with them. However, if we can define what that process boundary is, that'll help us define that ownership. And if we need to, separate the sub-processes and their ownership so that we can continue that management maturity across the processes. So ownership of the process is one of the key leadership and process management techniques to help start your maturing of your process further. Next, now we can start to understand that we have a process that's repeatable and it needs to be supported. We need to find direction for that process. Taking that ownership of the process and start thinking strategically, what are we going to do to help plan and help support this process for continued improvement and continued direction, continued maturity of that process. Once we have that support and direction, usually from a repeatable process, now we can start putting in definition into place and develop the process documentation associated with it. Now, process documentation comes in many forms, and I've seen some very innovative type of process documentation, including videos. So it doesn't always have to be a hard copy piece of paper or a manual, hard manual or even an electronic manual. So there's many ways to document a process. Even in ISO 9001 and AS 9100, there isn't a strict requirement for how you document a process. It says it just has to be documented somehow. And video, on-screen pictures, work instructions, SOPs, things like that, they all can help with that process documentation. You need to put it at the level to what the process needs. So that's where the process management comes into play to help understand how are people working within that process, understanding those process dynamics, the steps within the process, and executing them appropriately. So at that point, we define that process. Now that process definition can help us understand how do we take that again to the next level. And so now with that definition in play, we can go back, hold people accountable to the process steps for the repeatability that we're looking for, continuing to support and direct so that we can get that consistency in the process and then have the performance finally defined. At this point, now we need quality management. So quality management, what does quality mean? Most people go to the quality of a product, how good it is. Well, this is very similar. We will need to understand the process, the controls needed within that process, and the needs and expectations of the stakeholders that are working within, for, and around the process. In a defined process, we're typically having some suppliers of the process. It might be a pre-process, a different process that is flowing data, information, and or products into this process. We're transforming some value in that process, and then we go into the next process or out to our customers. Either way, they're customers, whether they are internal or external. Well, defining quality around that process helps us to understand the relevant controls and the needs and expectations, the requirements to define how that process, how far, how wide, how deep, and that quality to get to the outputs of the customer or to the outputs of the process for those customers' needs and expectations. So a defined process now to get to the next level of maturity for management. Now we need participation and control from management, process management, to understand and start to help make sure that we have the relevant performance of the process. So here's where that oversight and governance comes into play from a leadership perspective. Taking into account what it is the needs and expectations are from the process within and from the process stakeholders external to the process, whether they be on the supply side or on the customer side. From there, we take and we develop some process controls and measures. Those process and controls and measures help us understand that performance of the process. Then we can start to measure it, monitor it, and determine what the relevant status of that process is at any one time, and have it defined in a way that we can measure it over time and maybe use some statistics and things like that so that we can determine what to do next for improving process. At this point, we have a managed process. So it's from a defined process where we know what it is. Now we're tactically and we're strategically have leadership engaged with that process to manage it and continue to understand next levels for that process. So where are we at now with a managed process, and what do we need next to take that process, continue maturing it along with the management maturity associated with it to continue that journey? Process improvement. So in the past, we probably had some ad hoc process improvement. Somebody may have said something or did something to improve it. Now we put in strategic process improvement in play so that we can understand and start to support a proactive improvement to the process and understand how that process is going to work and continue in the future, and put objectives and goals in place for the process to be improved, both mature-wise and performance-wise. From there, we take and manage and plan now what's going to happen with the process, looking out short-term and long-term resources, applications, IT, technical solutions, process solutions. How do we all work that together and prioritize it so that we can continue building a better process over time with the stakeholders and the people working within the process? At this point now we're looking at from that managed process perspective and some of the improvements that have happened over the process maturity journey. How do we get to an optimize? We develop this process improvement strategy there. So that strategy now helps us determine and develop optimized process. So a process can get optimized so that we can continually improve it, adapting, adjusting, and continuing to move towards higher levels of performance based on a active and continuous improvement that works with management and with the process resources, along with the stakeholders that are external to the process. So now we've got optimized process. So you think this might be the end? I mean, we've got a great process. It's optimized. It's working great. So what else could we use to help in the management maturity of that process and continue optimizing it even further? Well, therefore, now we need to look at how do we integrate this across our organization and across the enterprise. Because optimized processes are good at a certain level. Now, when we put those processes within these other processes and the value streams that we have, we may find that there are some issues, barriers, situations where we need to find out how do these other processes around it work and support it, or they support it for a streamlined value stream. And at this point, now the stewardship and leadership comes into play from an executive and top management level. So looking at the ownership of the process, all the way up to the direction, the strategies, the continuous improvement, and now the integration, that stewardship looks across the processes, across the portfolio of processes, and the different levels of processes, where we have core, leadership, and support processes to determine now what are some of the process priorities that we can take into account and determine how that optimized process works in a whole system. At the system level, now we want to start understanding and looking at how do we develop these cooperative processes. So it's not just an independent process, but it's a process working with other processes, understanding the supply and the inputs into those processes, the outputs going into a different process, and those needs and expectations on both sides so that we can cooperate and understand how that works across the flow of the different value within the process itself. So at this point, now we have integrated processes. And so now we have that way for us to look across the portfolio, look across the enterprise, and start understanding a lot more detail about the processes themselves and the flow of information, the flow of value, the flow of production across the processes. Understand where there's constrictions or there are barriers to processes, and start prioritizing our efforts. At this point, process maturity has increased up to that level where that integration now helps us understand across the enterprise and down through all the other processes to understand the level of those process performances and how they match the levels of processes across that value stream. We also have the process maturity down here on the horizontal axis to help us continue to support that leadership engagement, stewardship, and the strategic alignment across the organization. Once you align that process management maturity with the process maturity, you can continue that flow of value up through the process to that integrated value. And then that's where innovation can really start taking and accelerate your improvement efforts. Here's where systems and things like that and change management come into play to understand across the processes. Now, how do we utilize our resources effectively, strategically, for continuing to improve those processes? So a few things to talk about in process management maturity, and how do we work with that process management maturity journey in helping the direction, support, and commitment. It's important to have that leadership and support across there so that we get that encouragement across the process. Ideally, we have some sponsorship and stewardship at play. As far down the process maturity, the process management maturity time frame is or perspective as long as we can, but getting that sponsorship at play and starting to mature that with the ownership of the process will help us to accelerate that process management maturity, and then therefore also accelerate the process maturity in itself. Leadership, leadership needs convincing at some of these points where you're getting that ownership at play and then trying to get the sponsorship, stewardship at play. For those of you starting on some of these lower maturing processes and organizations that don't have that integration and that higher levels of culture for process improvement, try small projects with impact. So think about a project you can get involved with on a process and show that working together with the people within the process and a process owner to go from an as-is state to a to-be state with the relevant performance known. Those small projects and that commitment to go and improve a process and show that you can utilize the resources within the process to help understand process improvement can help be convincing stories for executive leadership to get involved. This importance also increases as the management of process management increases. So as we go up through that process management maturity, executive and top leadership engagement and stewardship is important at higher and higher levels, and then therefore understanding how that support comes back within the process and the ownership to support those higher levels of maturity and improving the process. As we move through that, it's important when considering innovation and impacts across the organization and the value stream, because you want to be careful about where those process improvements are happening when you get into that integrated method of process management. There, it's more important to understand where those other processes may need help to support that consistent flow. So in leadership, we understand governance. We're looking at the decision makers, the strategy, accountability, priorities, alignment, and some of the objectives at play within the processes. Here's where roles, responsibilities, and authorities can help to define those for process management maturity. Understanding the approaches to be used within process improvement, process design, development, and improvement. What are some of the standards, the methodologies, and the tools that you're going to use? Executive and top leadership can help to support and provide some direction in that effort. Also, then here's where the interactions come into play when you're talking about higher levels of process maturity and process management maturity. Value stream mapping, visibility to management for within the process and across the process value stream, where there are core processes, where there's leadership process, where there's support processes, and how they interact with each other across those process connections. And then having the operating procedures, the policies, procedures, work instructions, and the relevant documentation associated with those processes to connect them together in a way that is driving improvement. And I've talked about this a little bit, but value stream mapping helps you to understand where those constrictions are within the value stream. Because sometimes, or most times, there is a process that is slower or less effective, has less productivity than other processes. And it can be a funnel and a barrier for process restriction. And those are from a process management maturity perspective, with those process managers, the ownership and leadership involved, now we can start helping to prioritize our process improvement efforts so they're not improving processes that are already outpacing sub processes or upstream processes, so that we can have overall flow and capacity to ensure those. So understanding that as is performance and using some of the relevant performance measures and metrics within processes will help us to understand those metrics. Using them across the portfolio and value stream gets you to that understanding of where the restriction is, where those barriers are, and now support how we can move into fixing those. So if you have low maturity processes, my recommendation is to use simple tools. Go back to SIPOC. If you haven't heard of SIPOC, Suppliers, Input, Process, Output, Customers is a simple tool to understand the scope and context of a process. A SIPOC is completed from the customer perspective first, and then it's gone in reverse to the outputs, the process inputs, and suppliers, to get a little more depth of information and the stakeholders involved, what the needs and expectations are, and the interactions within the steps of that process. Voice of the customer is another way to understand those needs and expectations of the process, and then also getting into the rationale for why we need this process and why the customer needs that output. PDCA is the simple continuous improvement process. Plan, do, check, act. Plan an improvement, do it, check to see if it was effective, act on that learning, and then loop right back into a new cycle of improvement. Root cause analysis using the 5 whys to start understanding where the problems are within a process and driving down to that root cause instead of just fixing superficial causes within a process that don't fix the underlying problem, and therefore it continues to crop up. And then finally, 5S from a lean perspective to understand the waste in your process and remove that waste. When we get to higher maturity processes and process management, then we can start using more complex methods and tools. We can look at value stream mapping, true value stream mapping, where it's not only the process steps, but the information flow, the actual physical flow if we have products, the information flow if it's a service, and the service outputs from those processes. What's the timing of each process step, and the dwell time in between processes, and where there's barriers. Using that, then we can start understanding those levels of performance and across a full value stream. Also using Lean Six Sigma. Six Sigma is a understanding of the variation within the process. Lean is understanding where there's waste in the process. Now we can take those at a deeper level and truly get to the value across that value stream and start understanding how to really accelerate those improvements from a technical and a data-driven fashion. Statistical process control, talked a little bit about understanding the performance of your process and when things are in control and out of control, and where there's trends associated with it. Using some of the rules within statistics that tells us from the process what's going on and what we can do with it. And finally, portfolio management. That's where true integration comes into play. And now we can start understanding across the enterprise, where are those processes that need to be focused on, need to be prioritized, and continue to work on in that continuous improvement mode. So finally here, what can we do to help in this maturity method, both for the process and process management? APQC ABPMP, a couple of organizations out there that are very strong on process improvement and process focus. They've got a couple of life cycles and strategies at play to understand what's going on within the process, where the alignment or misalignment is, the leadership involved with it, the direction and strategy, and then start taking continuous improvement into play to help build those processes into higher levels of performance, and then maturing the process across the value stream and across the management and techniques used within. So finally, the steps for process management maturity: to recognize and organize, leadership, understanding that something needs to happen with a process because of the importance with it, then supporting that process directly through ownership and directing its future through improvement, gaining the participation and control within the process, both from internal process resources and stakeholders, and then outside the process to understand how do we make sure that we're delivering the value that the customer wants from that process, whether that be an internal customer or an external customer. Then we manage and plan the process so that we can optimize the process and start putting in strategic plans for building that process maturity higher, getting into the integrated process where stewardship and leadership across the organization at an executive level helps to provide that direction and alignment across the organization and across the process owners for value stream management and the prioritization of the process improvement directives and the limited resources that we have within there. So that's where we take that process management and mature it from the ownership all the way up to the executive leadership levels. All right, with that, I'd like to open it up for any questions, comments.
Yes, Jim, thank you so much for presenting on this topic. So we are going to move on to our Q&A portion. We might have time for a few. I do apologize in advance if we do not get to all of the questions here. And we will also add in the CCAP's info email if you would like for us to pass on questions to Jim. So our first question here. Yes, our first question here is, when you have a culture resistance to change, what would be your strategic approach to introduce process change? Do you wait for the right time, like adverse situation, to get started for the greatest impact?
Great question. And from my own experience, my own failures and learnings, go. So start small, just like I started talking about in that lower levels of process maturity. Start small. Try to find those quick wins that you can get the relationships built with process owners and with the stakeholders around the process, from the supply side of a process and the customer side of the process. Develop those relationships and understand those needs and expectations so you can start with just quick wins and or small improvements that make a big impact on the process itself and the performance. The other thing to support that and to supplement it is start measuring your processes at some level. Don't go too wild. Try to figure out, what is that process value we're trying to deliver, and start measuring that value in the simplest form you can.
Great. Yeah, well, that will go nicely into our next question here. How often should a process be reviewed to ensure maturity is still there?
Oh, wow. So my favorite answer to that, especially when I'm doing auditing also, is it depends. Understanding the process maturity first from a performance level and from a process management level may take a little bit of insight into the process. APQP, APQC, and ABPMP, they do have some checklists and or surveys you could use to work through and kind of understand at a very high level what our relevant maturity is. But from the information you've seen here, you can take some of these direct different levels of maturity and kind of understand. So if you don't have any formality associated with it, use a practical small team, somebody who you trust, and just start talking about, do we recognize and organize this process? Do we support and direct? Do we have participation and control? Do we have it managed, and are we planning improvements? Are we planning strategies for it? Do we have top level leadership, stewardship, and engagement to help lead us and help direct us in it? So it might be very simple, or you could go to more formal methods. And I could point to some of those after if somebody wants to email me and get some of those assessments.
Awesome. So I think we'll just do one more here. Um, what are best practices for determining granularity with process definition? The next part here is describing high-level process flow can result in ambiguity and inconsistencies, but ultra-granular process definition can bog down employees and hide over constraints. I'm curious of your thoughts on how deep to go with definitions.
And that's where I will go back again to using simple tools and techniques when you're in low maturity processes, and start using higher levels of tools and techniques with higher levels of maturity. If you have a lower level of maturity, start with something simple. And that includes metrics and measures. Measure, as simple as you can to get some understanding of performance. As you learn, you can adapt and add measurements that add value. And that's a key point. Find out where the value is. Start measuring where the value is created, both from an input and an output side, to understand that how do you want to take and improve that process through that performance understanding.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jim. So that is going to be the last of our questions. Again, if you have any further, please send them to ccapsinfo@umn.edu, and we'll pass those along to Jim and he can follow up. And can you share the next slide, please, Jim? Wonderful. So CCAPS now offers flexible workforce development solutions designed to equip employees with targeted knowledge and skills for your organization's needs. Our program includes industry-driven bachelor's and master's programs, along with 12 non-credit certificates and over 80 individual courses. If you or someone in your organization would like to learn more, please schedule a consultation with our business development representative, Beth Laurie. And if you can go to the next slide. Here. As I mentioned earlier, we will send a link to the webinar recording within a week of today's webinar. The recording will also be posted to our CCAPS webinar archive, as well as our CCAPS YouTube page. We also welcome feedbacks. Please use the QR code listed to provide any suggestions for our future productions. And the University of Minnesota employees are now eligible to receive well-being points for listening to our webinars. So please view the link and use the form there to submit that, and our college contact information, as well as the business process improvement certificate that Jim does teach in, is linked there as well. So thank you all again. Thank you, Jim, so much for presenting with us today, and you all have a wonderful afternoon.
Thanks again for your time. I look forward to hearing any other questions forwarded my way. Have a great day.